Our next panel, the one just before lunch, so hang in there, is the AI skill set. I'd like to welcome that panel to the stage, please, led by our moderator, Barbara Dyer, who comes to MIT Sloan from the Hitachi Foundation, where she was the CEO. We're very pleased to have her here as a senior lecturer and working on the Good Companies, Good Job initiative here at the Sloan School. And joining her is Becky Frankiewicz from Manpower Group, Tom Hopcroft from MassTLC, and Todd Loofbourrow of ViralGains. So please, come on up.
We have this unfortunate position to be one, the panel before lunch, so in between, I know you're all hungry, and also to be a panel that is kind of focusing on a lot of the things that have come out already in this conference. I would say that in thinking about this day and a half that we've had, the one thing that we can all agree on is that we're in this incredible moment of transition. And there are all sorts of predictions that we've heard, and some of them are really pretty exhilarating. But we don't have yet a really strong narrative about this future. And so part of what we need to do as a society is try to figure out, well, what is that narrative that's going to kind of guide us into this future? I want to, before we actually get into this conversation, I want to thank CSAIL and IDE for orchestrating this amazing couple of days and bringing all of these people together. And I also want to highlight some of the questions that we've been debating the last couple of days. And that is, what does it actually imply for this society, this sort of infusion of automation and artificial intelligence? As we begin to think about this matching, this dance that we're in with machines, what is the future of work? And in particular, how is it that this technology, this future that we're imagining, plays out for that 66 or 67% of people, at least in this country, that don't have a college degree? So how does this shape and even create a better future for that part of the population? And I think we've heard some seeds of that. And what is the wraparound? What is the infrastructure? What are the institutions that are going to make this transition work smoothly? And how do we, in each of our roles, influence that future? So I'd like to also bring some real texture to this. I'd like to actually look at some of the people who are struggling with or who are in the midst of it, and I think we had a great portrait through Rusty's story earlier. But Becky Frankiewicz, I want to turn to you and Manpower Group and help us get a sense of what it is that people that you're encountering or struggling with. I know you're working with a whole veterans population. You're trying to do some of the work that Rusty did, which is to translate, what he did was translate the sort of core capacities that a coal miner has into this new world. And you're doing the same thing with veterans. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about that and in the process also give us a handle on what Manpower Group is, because I think what we heard from Rusty, we see in what you're doing and potentially at a much larger scale. So let's start with that.
Thank you, Barbara. What I'd say first is it's been fascinating to hear the conversation around AI's impact on the future of work versus it's already happening today. And we heard a little of that from the professor from Northwestern, a little from the gentleman from JobCase, but we would argue we're seeing that impact today. And we've been talking about this skills gap at Manpower Group for about a decade now. And it really resulted in what we call the skills revolution, this bifurcation of the haves and the have-nots. And I'm not talking about money, I'm talking about skill. Who has the skill and who doesn't have the skill? And we've heard over the last few days, there's a growing population of people who do not have the skill. So the first question we asked is, okay, so what is the skill? You know, we talk about it in these high levels, but what are the skills? And so we partnered with DMDII out of Chicago to identify a skills taxonomy for 160 roles around digital manufacturing. So new skills, new jobs. And then we took 20 of those and did deep role descriptions around those. So that's step one. What are the skills? Step two is who can do that work? We have 6 million open jobs in America today. We have people that have skills that need to reskill, and we heard that too, reskill. Well, how do you do that? So then we partnered after DMDII with Rockwell Automation to actually partner with veterans. So we took 1,000 veterans, or we're training 1,000 veterans to upskill them in digital manufacturing. And so you say, why veterans? So it's about skill adjacency, finding people who have similar skills, and you heard it from Rusty. So Rusty, I don't know if you're still here, but I was wowed by your story, and thank you for everything that you're doing. Very inspiring. Similar process. So we take what are the adjacent skills, find a population that has those skills, and then put them to work. So I'll tell you one story about a gentleman named Chris. So Christopher was in the military for 8 years. He was an artillery specialist. He served our country. He retired from the military and came out. Young man, needed a job. Had a high school degree and military training, that was it. And so he looked at his life and said, well, what am I skilled to do? So he took a job in a call center making $30,000 a year. We partnered with Rockwell around the Academy of Advanced Manufacturing, and so we called Christopher and said, Christopher, we have a 12-week training program for you around a new skill set in digital manufacturing. And so Christopher's wife thought it was too good to be true, so literally she called and said, this is too good to be true, you're gonna train him for 12 weeks and get him a job. And we said yes. And so I'm proud to say today, Chris has gone through the program. He's one of our top candidates, and he has several job offers that will double his salary. So that's what we need to do. Identify the skills, find a partner population with adjacent skills, train them, and then help them get work. So that's what we're about.
So what I'm hearing in this story is a means toward the future. It's a transition mechanism.
Yes.
What we heard in the last panel is that ultimately we won't be in transition because life is a continuous path of transition. Yes. And that, I mean, maybe I was ahead of my time, but this is at MIT, this is my 10th job, and 5 of them were before I was 30. So I get it.
You're like a millennial.
I get it. But ultimately, that's part of the story of who we are or about to become, which is that we're not retraining, we're always training. We're not reskilling, we're always building these skills. And there need to be mechanisms ongoing forever, everywhere at our fingertips to allow us to do that. Is that the way you see it too?
Yes, and we actually have coined the phrase learnability. So skills are the new currency. It's not about what you know how to do, it's what you can learn how to do. So I have 3 daughters. 65% of the jobs my daughters will face don't exist today. So for college educators, what are you going to teach them? I mean, you can't teach them about the job. You have to teach them this ability to be continually curious and continually learning. Skills are the new currency.
Right. So at this moment, you can develop this taxonomy, and you can look at specific tasks that are digitally enabled tasks, and you can make that translation. But ultimately, this panel is called AI skills, but really we're talking about skills for this future economy, or the economy where we are now, which aren't about those specific tasks in that taxonomy as much as navigational tools.
The ability to adjust and adapt.
Right. And Tom, you've talked a little bit about that when we've had our conversations and the way you're thinking about sort of the core competencies that are needed in this AI-infused sort of general economy and general society.
Right.
Talk about that a little bit.
So I represent the Mass Tech Leadership Council.
Right.
So we're the largest tech group in the state. So we're representing a lot of the people who are building the robots and the AI that are helping build this future. As everyone knows, there's a tremendous need for talent. So when I look at the tech companies and the industries can't get enough talent, and yet we're a fairly homogeneous, white male population. So if you buy into the notion that talent is distributed evenly in populations, which we firmly believe, then there's a lot of talent around. If you brought women to the level of men, you'd bring 78,000 people off the sidelines. If you look into a lot of different groups here or across the country, I mean, Rusty's example was great. And so here and now, we focus a lot on getting girls exposed to coding. So we have a program through our Ed Foundation that work on that, and trying to bring different populations into this. But as you look longer term, I think, and as you look broader than sort of the technology bubble that we live in here, I think it does come down, Rusty said, aptitude. I think, having Fred had said 66% or whatnot. He said some percentage of those people, some of those people will work in very sort of human-oriented jobs that are not easily automated, like construction or healthcare or other dealing with people and interacting. But there's a bunch of those people who have the aptitude, who could be the coders in Appalachia, and we desperately need them as an industry to keep moving forward. So I think it's a time, tech pays twice the state average here. It's a time that you could flow a lot of capital back into a lot of different communities and increase the performance of our companies and decision making, while providing a lot of opportunity for a lot of people who've been left out so far. One last, I guess, note on that is that when you start to look at the different demographics, we're not making great progress. The Asian and Indian population already participates at a higher level than the white population. The Hispanic and Latino cohort in 20 or so years may reach that. But when you look at the African American community or women, we're basically making no progress. And so conversations like this, I think, are important.
Yeah, so we've heard a lot in the last day and a half that might give us some optimism. But first, Rusty talks about overcoming the stereotype, the hillbilly stereotype, and embracing it and making it part of the strength of his story. Question is whether your members would view Rusty's business as a credible business, and how do you get over that stereotypical gap? The other that Fred talked about is that a variety of ways of validating competencies might emerge from all of this. That is, we look at 66% of the population that doesn't have a college degree, and we assume that, sort of stereotypically, that they lack the skills that we need. But there are other forms of validating competencies that maybe will emerge, and maybe AI can help us do that. And so that actually is a hopeful picture. Todd, I know I could kind of pitch almost anything to you, and you can take it in any direction. But one thing that people probably don't know about you is your role with Jobs for the Future, which is an organization that I'm quite familiar with, that is working on these issues, and particularly with a focus on this 66%. And in more economically isolated populations. What do you see in all of this for that population and in this picture that we're painting?
Yeah, I think, I always like to do panels and talks in the context of the audience. And so we have here a very educated, very scientific audience. And so we're going to look at a lot of the solutions to these problems from a technology lens. STEM education, online learning, those sorts of things. And they're clearly a big part of the problem, or the solution. But I think of the question a little differently, which is there's 1 million truck drivers in the US. Cars will drive themselves someday soon. Where do those 1 million truck drivers go? And it's not necessarily technology that will be their answer. As Becky said, it's adjacencies of skills. So let me ask the audience a question. How many of you have, let's say at least 3 times, been on the campus of an elite university like this one, any 4-year college, in some professional capacity, going to a talk, giving a talk, attending a class? All right, terrific. How many of you have been at least 3 times in the same sort of professional capacity at a community college? So that, to me, is one of the things we can do better, which is we live in this world of elite schools and technology. But in fact, a lot of where this will get solved is at the community college level, where it's actually accessible for people to get some of the skills they can use in the new economy. So if you're an academic at MIT, finding ways to get that population to learn the things you know. If you're a company thinking not just of going to MIT, Harvard, and Stanford when you hire, but thinking about your customer service reps and going to Bunker Hill Community College. We have a gentleman, Parker, who's one of our sales development reps. He tries to find new business for us. He was a lobsterman and grew up in a family of lobstermen. And yet the skills that he developed as a lobsterman, persistence, comfort with long work hours, long periods of time where he's not getting success, make him exceptional at that new job. So I'd summarize by saying there's two things. Soft skills are as important as knowledge. And so as we think about these competencies, as Becky said, we think about these skills, we have to look at training people in things like resilience, self-starting, navigating. We have to do a better job helping people know what the pathway is from where they are to where they need to be, what courses they need to take, where can they take them, where can they afford them, how do they get to them, how does it fit their learning style. We need to address issues like kids with depression and anxiety and these things that are barriers to them. So, and it's from a Jobs from the Future context. JFF is about a $50 million nonprofit. They work at the juncture of two areas that I think everyone here has an opportunity to cross into the one you're not from. They're called education and workforce. And education is what probably most of us in this room do, teach people things. Workforce is companies who are looking for certain skills. And if we're working at the juncture of what companies might need and what we're teaching people, we're working on the right part of the problem.
Can I add
I was just going to turn to Becky, so go ahead.
I just want to add something. One, I love your comment around community colleges, because I think we want people to show up ready for work, not just graduates, but ready for work. And so I think that's a really important part of our environment that we don't leverage necessarily. And the other thing you talked about was soft skills. I had a chance to speak at the Chicago Fed a few weeks ago, and a gentleman from Purdue raised his hand because we're talking about STEM. And it was a little provocative question, what do you think about the future of STEM, and what about everything else? And he proposed, and I thought it was interesting, that we call it STEAM, so that the arts come in, because that brings the soft skills and it brings the connectedness, the way of thinking, the learnability into the equation. So I think that's really interesting.
Just to pick up on Becky's point about ready for work. I mean, so in this continuous learning environment, what does ready mean?
Yeah, so it's exactly what Todd said. You take what is the demand, what is the supply, and how do you bridge that gap? So ready, we've seen, even in my professional lifetime, we've seen employers become consumers of work, not creators of talent. And so someone has to create the talent. And that's where we see a big part of our job is in between, identifying the skills, identifying the population, and how do you train these workers to be ready for work, not just graduates of college.
So intermediary institutions like Manpower, like community colleges, will play an increasingly important role?
Absolutely, and anyone who is willing to train and develop. And I would argue that even employers have to get back to that. We all have to be developers of talent with the skill gaps we have today.
Again, it's wonderful to have a story like Rusty's right in front of us, because here we had a situation where the community college wasn't ready. The employer, this new startup, had to figure out how to get people up to speed and make that transition and translation. Community college came along sometime after, and now may be in a position to do more. So then the employer begins to think about, well, what is the training that we do? What is the learning in the job, and what is the learning around the job that is provided in the community, in the context of a community college in this instance? I'm sorry, Tom, you wanted to weigh in.
Oh, I was just going to comment that our robotics community likes to refer to it as STREAM, science, technology, robotics, engineering, and math.
Okay.
So we want to get the robotics
the stream
in there.
and the steam. Right,
exactly. But our companies, they're often looking for very sophisticated talent, but there isn't enough of it. And so a lot of it is about adjacencies. And so, some companies can really compete for like the top of the top here at MIT. Others may go down the food chain. We have a very wide one, but I'm seeing more companies going laterally and saying, well, if I can get a physicist or a mathematician or someone else that I can transfer over, it's not dealing with the 66% problem, but it's related.
So, but thinking about the sort of validation of capabilities, what do you imagine might be that future, and how might AI play a role? I mean, I think Fred's point was quite interesting. But in the context of the work that you're doing, Becky, would sort of validation from Manpower be sufficient? I know Goodwill does some of this, and community. Is it employer to employer? I mean, I've been in a number of hospitals where the supervisory tier is validating the work of a medical assistant based on performance on the floor. I mean, what are the ways in which this might?
Yes, I think we will see more partnerships and associations come up between universities and businesses, between businesses and businesses. So the example I gave was with Rockwell Automation. It's a business-to-business partnership. We created an academy of advanced manufacturing, and so people go through the academy trained, and that is credibility when they come out. So I think we'll see more and more of that. particularly for the percent of the population that does have a high school degree but doesn't have other degrees.
Right. So in a transition like this, where there's so much churning and there's so many questions at absolutely every level, there are questions about, and Eric raises them all of the time, and they're exactly the right questions, is what does the education system need to look like? Because we have a school-to-work mentality, a K-12 system, a school-to-work. It's no longer school-to-work, it's school and work, work and school, ongoing. So what does that look like, and what are the challenges? What is the future of the firm? What does the firm look like? How does the firm organize itself and organize its people in this environment, and what are the operational strategies and the management strategies that are going to be important in this future? What is the role of intermediary organizations? What are the institutions that are going to be important? How do we think about the distribution of power in all of this, and how do workers regain more voice? And I don't think we have those answers yet. But in this moment where we don't have the answers, but people are trying to make their way and make a life and make a living, what do you all imagine we need to put into place to respond to what I consider to be a fundamentally human need, which is this sense of stability and a sense of confidence in their ability to move through this while we're sorting all of this out? And this is not a question that we've talked about, and it may not be fair, but you're all shaking your head. So let's hear what you have to say about it.
Can I throw out one thought? I'm sorry, I missed a few pieces of the conference earlier on, but in the time I've been here, I haven't heard this talked about. We're talking a lot about how AI is going to disrupt all these jobs and this need to prepare people for the future. I haven't heard a lot of conversation about using AI to help educate people. You have people who have all different learning abilities, different levels, different styles, et cetera. And it seems that we could use the technology to, and we are, I think Curriculum Associates and others are using the technology to better personalize the experience and help people learn at the pace they need to learn and in the ways that they learn best. So it seems that there's a role here
Absolutely.
to help personalize it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And some things like language learning online now are optimized for people's learning styles. So AI can certainly be part of the solution. I have a long arc in this AI business. I built robots as a kid and wrote a book about robotics when I was 16. Eric Brynjolfsson and I ran an AI consulting firm together in the 80s. And one of the systems we did dropped $200 million to the bottom line at State Farm. Now, how did it do that? By eliminating the underwriting assistant job and replacing it with an expert system. So the job impact of these technologies is very real, and the current wave of AI, which is much more successful than the one in the 80s due to computing capacity, is doing more and more erosion of jobs at the bottom of the middle class. I think of it in terms of, for each one of us, what are two things we can do to make the problem better? And I would challenge us to say, what's one in our comfort zone, and what is one outside of our comfort zone? For example, education in the US at the elite university level has a cost problem, and therefore an accessibility problem. That's a very real issue. It's hard for people to get there. So MIT can do something like edX, which is a phenomenal program making the expertise available to lots of people. And what else can someone at MIT do to make online learning easier for people to understand or more accessible? So think about something outside your comfort zone. Because I think where the transitions really happen is where you're meeting people where they are. And I think for those of us who come from sort of elite university backgrounds, we don't really understand where these people are. And that's the place we should start, because the rest of it will be easy for us. That'll be the part that's hard, and that'll be the part that ultimately makes the difference. How do we teach teamwork? How do we teach resilience? My engineers need better skills on teamwork, but so does the truck driver who's going to go become a home healthcare worker.
There's an assumption sort of implicit, and I think, and I can understand it completely, but the assumption is that we, MIT, have a lot to teach those in Pikesville, Kentucky, for example, or central Wisconsin, or wherever the problem is most concentrated. But what we heard from Rusty is we've got a lot to learn.
Yes, no question.
Because there are tremendous strengths in these places as well. So thinking about outside of our comfort zone and abandoning some of our stereotypes, recognize that there's this two-way learning process. Just
And one of your visions on this panel, Barbara, that I like so much is you said to us last night and in our prep call, we want to humanize this topic. We want to make this very human. And so one of the things I notice, having managed organizations of various sizes over the years, is there's this concept psychologists talk about uncertainty stress and challenge stress. Challenge stress is good. I'm going to get it done. I can figure it out. I know the tools. Uncertainty stress is bad. So we're in a world now where, because of automation and AI, there's much more uncertainty stress in people's career paths. So as educators, as policymakers, as firms, what can we do to reduce the uncertainty stress of different kinds of people becoming parts of our organization or accessing the tools we have, and turn uncertainty stress into challenge stress? I think that's a central issue.
Yeah, and I think that's central to the question I was posing, which is we are in this moment of uncertainty. It's not going to become certain for a long time, if ever, so maybe uncertainty is a norm.
Well, Barbara, I want to, before you move on to another question, I just want to jump off your series of questions and offer a different perspective. A lot of them were, what is the university going to do? What is the firm, the future of the firm? Well, I would say we have a lot of responsibility there, but let's not underestimate that human beings are starting to solve this on their own. So we heard about the gig economy earlier. Next generation work represents 16% of our workforce. And you might say, well, that's still small. It grew almost 60% in the last 10 years. So 16% of the workforce growing almost 60% in the last 10 years. People are taking this on themselves to solve it. And so it was interesting, we did the study around next gen work and said, okay, but probably those people, it's last resort. It's job of last resort, they're having to do it.
Right.
Well, 81% of Americans that are working that way are saying it's their choice. And so I think we have a responsibility, but let's not underestimate human beings are going to solve this. So if we're not partnering with that population, to your point, to understand, how do you want to work? What is flexibility today? There will be a whole grassroots effort, which I actually would applaud, around people taking responsibility and accountability for their own learnability.
Can I add one more point on top of that one, Barbara? No.
You may not.
It's interesting. I was looking at the stats last night after our conversation, because Barbara and I did a Federal Reserve panel a couple of weeks ago, and we were looking at this issue of the gig economy in the context of policymaking. So put yourself in the shoes of Uber and Lyft. Uber and Lyft have their drivers as 1099 independent contractors because they don't want to pay the taxes and they don't want to have to do background checks and lots of reasons they want to do that. And you can argue whether that's good or bad, but not taking a position on that for a minute, it constrains them. I talked to every one of my Uber and Lyft drivers, probably talked to 300 of them, and them getting health insurance is a tough issue. Let's say Uber or Lyft were motivated to do the right thing and wanted to do group buying and offer group health insurance to those gig-based drivers. They can't. They'll run afoul of the 1099 versus employee regulations. So for policymakers, regulations have to evolve to the gig economy. I've been studying this whole Uber Lyft thing for years. The average Uber driver, in the latest stats they've released, which are still a couple years old, makes $364 a month. That's not a lot of money. Yet there's millions of them. And they're doing some Uber and some Lyft and some TaskRabbit. So I think we owe ourselves to be both fascinated and optimistic about this world, but also honest about the quality of these jobs for building family-sustaining careers. And I think there's some real open questions there.
It's not unreasonable for us to ask the question, what do we really want for ourselves as a society? And where does work play the role? And to make some decisions in shaping this future that actually honor individuals and families and find ways for people to make their way through all of this. And the question is, what are the institutions? What are the mechanisms? Our political apparatus, at least for the time being, seems to be broken and incapable of addressing this. We have intermediary organizations that are helping in some ways. But how do we even arrive as a society at something that weaves it together that says this is what's important and this is how our future of work needs to be guided? What are the principles even? How do we arrive at them? Any thoughts about that?
I mean, Tom
It's getting away from AI's skill set.
But Tom was talking about this last night. The states are supposed to be the great laboratories of democracy. So if we kind of assume for a moment that the federal government is broken, there are certainly, now states can't change W-2 1099 policy and group health insurance buying, but states can try things in incubators, in what they fund, and what they encourage, and what they promote. Right. And I think with 50 laboratories, we can find some things. Just as the time of, Eric talks about this, in the time of the agricultural revolution a century ago, what really changed things at scale in the Green Revolution was experimental programs funded around the country, and some of them worked.
And I'd like to add to that and couple with that I think small and mid-sized companies are the laboratories of capitalism.
Absolutely.
And just as we saw this morning, and that, you know, in the work that we do traveling around the country and the work that you're doing with manufacturers, there's just tremendous reason for optimism out there.
So I was going to say, you know, Massachusetts really does innovate in a lot of ways. Our industry does, but I think our government is actually doing a pretty good job too. You know, the issue of immigration came up earlier, and we know all the research says that immigrants are job creators and innovators. They will not only bring a lot to us, but the native population does more when they're here. Obviously, we have some issues with federal immigration policy, and so Massachusetts set up the Global Entrepreneur in Residence program, where UMass serves as the entity to get your H-1B visa. You work, you know, a day or so a week there while you create your startup.
Great.
So it's a nice little workaround. Similarly, when we're talking about community colleges, you know, Massachusetts has done some really interesting things with the community colleges. And I'm on the board of higher ed, and so the community colleges and the state colleges, they've created a mass transfer program where you can have, you know, interoperability of credits between the different universities to allow people to get through the process quicker. But we do have, you know, beyond this, and this is drifting off of our topic a bit, the next 15 years, we're going to be seeing a decline of our, just demographically, of the number of people coming through high school and graduating. So that's going to put some pressure on it. And we're seeing an increasingly diverse population in the coming out of high school. A lot of those communities are graduating at lower rates, and so that's going to put even more pressure on it. And so where I sit in the industry, looking at, you know, the demand that we have for talent, you know, we really have to figure out the bold leadership, these, you know, innovative things that we can do. What can we steal from other states? You know, how do we figure out in an environment, as you say, that's a little bit dysfunctional at the top?
Great. So the one question that in one of our earlier conversations, and we were talking about we should do this and we should do that, the question is, who's the we? Who is the we? Who has authority? Who has convening power? This is a great evidence of convening power of a sort. But all of us have been to dozens of conferences on this topic with different parts of the community. And who's the we?
And so I'd also, you said the firm earlier. Who's the firm?
Yeah.
I mean, what is the role? What is a firm in the future? Because this idea of people, and you're an example of it, of people going and taking a job with a company and staying their whole life, that's done. The ideas of pension are done. Those are done. And so if you think about then, therefore, what is the role of a company? It's about training and developing a workforce. And that's for all companies, I would say. And that's in partnership with education. I think it is in partnership with government, whether it's local or federal government. It has to be in partnership with government.
Yeah, I'd push back on that a little bit, maybe because I'm at a management school, but the role of the firm, to me, is to produce products and services that people value in a marketplace. Question is, how do we organize to produce that in ways that actually generate value across multiple dimensions?
And are inclusive, you know, because
and are sustainable.
Yes, for sure. If I can address your question in a way that I want to add a shout out here. I think for each of us, it's incumbent on us in our area of expertise to treat these issues as important, and not just in discussion with each other, but in a discussion with the broader world. I'm here in part because when I wrote my essay to Harvard, and the question was, what's your favorite book? I wrote about Professor Winston's artificial intelligence book. It was my favorite book. And so that was an inspiration for me to begin a career in artificial intelligence. So if you're an academic, if you're a writer, if you're thinking about what the research you do next is, think about these underserved populations. And when you look at Brexit and what's going on around the world and political instability and what the heck are all these voters and what are they thinking, realize that these issues are triggered in large part, certainly as a large contributor to the job displacement that's going on in people who don't know how to make change. And so you can be the change you want to see in the politics in Washington or in the world that's coming if you address these issues in a way that's inclusive of the populations who need to manage uncertainty stress.
Yeah, just as I think about, you know, who is the authority, you know, one of the things that you know, this conference and some of the folks here have helped me think about over time is, you know, this whole notion of the industrial era. that we used to be a lot more independent before. And as we look at, and then we sort of organize, and it's very hierarchical. I have a centralized health facility, a doctor that I go to, or a company that's very structured. And we're looking at, companies are reorganizing, and it's more distributed and more ecosystem oriented, a broader sort of horizontal platform. And so I wonder if, I don't know, but if some of this will emerge in many areas interacting with each other without maybe the central top down. I feel this want for bold leadership and someone to tell us where to go, but I sense that might not be the way it's going to play out.
Kind of messy. I want to invite the audience into this conversation. If you have something you want to add or ask or contribute, come up to the mic. Otherwise, we'll just keep talking. So please join us. I do see some people coming up.
Great.
Yes, tell us who you are,
Hi,
too. It'd be nice to know.
Ahmed Oskan from IBM Research.
Great.
I would like to add a new perspective. What we have today is mostly narrow AI technologies, not general, and you can see them as specialists. We talked about radiology type applications, where the system is really good at classifying some anomaly in a very specific domain, maybe one part of the body, one type of radiology. So I see that in the next 5 years, these type of narrow AI technologies will propagate. This is the low-hanging fruit. So what we need in the AI skill set is really people who can, first of all, take advantage of these systems, but I think we will need more interdisciplinary people who have a broad overview, who can connect the dots. I think we went too far into this specialist as the history of science. We had a lot of polymaths who had breakthroughs because they had a whole perspective of the science. I think as the AI makes progress, we will need a lot of these type of skill sets. People who can, we don't have time to read all the literature anymore because number of publications grow very fast. So
Do we know how to cultivate that connecting the dots approach to life? I mean, one of my early careers was I have a bachelor's in fine arts, so I did a lot of art. And in an arts education, that's really the framing of it. I mean, it is a lot of connecting the dots. But I don't know that we've really figured out sort of more generally how to cultivate a population across the board that has that. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, maybe encouraging broad education. We encourage too much specialization, PhDs.
So we need to move more broadly.
More broadly.
And STEAM instead of STEM.
Yep.
Stream.
STEAM
Or
and STEM.
STEAM. STEM, stream, STEAM.
And I think it's an organizational issue in how we organize the academy, if you will, because we're organized by department. And when a science is new, you got to go deep to find the mysteries to still be unlocked. And that's still the case in every one of these departments. But I always think innovation happens at the edges. And so, I think I don't know the answer, but I think you're asking the right question, which is how do we systematically, in the way we train people, help them find the edges? As one example, I would use Olin College, which I think just does an exceptional job. Their students are brilliant. I've hired probably half a dozen of them. And they know how to work on teams. They leap easily from discipline to discipline. They're trained to be detectives, not to memorize. And so I think it's an issue of how we, in universities, organize to build cross-disciplinary thinkers who can figure out what they have to go narrow but deep in.
Exactly.
When I did say back, not just in college, but like I have 2 daughters in high school, we were meeting with the professors and they said, hey, we're going to teach them to think why something happened, not what happened. The regurgitation of information is an old way of teaching. How do we teach the why behind it?
Right. Let's go to another question. Thank you. Tell us who you are.
Juhi Dhawan. I'm a private sector economist. I'm curious to hear how you reconcile the specialization that has resulted in so many job openings at record levels versus some of the conversation I'm hearing here today, which is about having generalized skills and being able to adapt them to whatever's put in front. It almost seems like companies have been less willing to work with generalists and really want that very specific skill, preventing some of these openings from being utilized. So I'm curious to hear some thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just say I think we've had the luxury of that decision in companies today. But as we see now an increasing demand and a diminished supply, that luxury will go away, and the pace of change is accelerating. So I would say the difference in the 3 revolutions and now the 4th industrial revolution, it's not just the convergence of physical, digital, and biological. I mean, that is a huge change, and it changes not just the way we work. If you think about its predecessors, it was the way we work. This one changes the way we work, the way we live, the way we connect. I mean, we've already emailed, we'll be texting, the way we connect with each other. And I would say the pace of change is what will reduce the ability of choosing a role, a specialist versus a skill.
And I would just add to that I think, particularly in the near term, industry has an incredibly high demand for technically skilled people.
Today. Yep.
Over time, though, as the tools get better, they become more accessible, and you don't need as high level of skill. And at the same time, you have technology. We were hearing before about how the AI will write the code for us. Right. And so if you project further out, I think if you're the statistic about 65% of the jobs that a young child will have haven't been created yet. Those are the jobs, I think, as I think about it anyway, that I'm like, you probably don't want to go deep in learning some technology. You want to have this interdisciplinary abilities.
And
but right now we need the.
I'd just say the jobs, he's right, jobs will still exist. There will still be roles. It's just they will change rapidly. And so I may have a job today that's gone away in 6 months, and I have to learn a new job. I mean, there'll be still jobs.
I love the example of veterinary psychiatrist. I know, nobody could have imagined that before. Yes, tell us who you are.
Hi, thank you. My name is Kevin Dooley, and I'm a practitioner, then academic. I work in human resources for Deutsche Bank, but my background is in industrial organizational psychology. Very impressive discussion so far. I was attracted to your comment about stress, positive and negative stress. I'd like to ask you guys what your thoughts are around organizational culture and incentives around taking these new technologies and incentivizing management, leadership, and employees in utilizing them for their benefit as opposed to their detriment. I've been through major reorganizations in manufacturing with SAP implementations in the 90s to right now. We're automating jobs, and people are wondering what's going on with robo-advisors and so forth. But I do think there's a gap in culture change, digital leadership, and how you align those incentives to get employees to utilize these new things.
Yeah, there's so much variation in leadership, and I can say that I've gone around and looked at many, many companies in manufacturing and healthcare that have done it right and that have redefined what their business is. I'm thinking of one particular steel company that went from producing commodity bagel baskets to producing customized products for Boeing, for example, and did it in a manner that brought his entire workforce along. Basically said, we have a different customer, a different product, we're using different technologies, and everybody in this firm is going to help make this real. And they put into place operational strategies, skills matrices, training. They've combined designers with the engineers in one space. They've done, and everybody is connected to that change. And that's hard to do. It sounds lovely, and it's a great culture, and it is. But I don't want to minimize how difficult it is to move from an old style to that new style. But I see this happening in a lot of companies. And in particular, we were looking at companies where there are lots of lower skilled workers making that transition as automation and people are working quite well together. I heard recently of another one in Wichita that makes pizza ovens. And they've made a decision to fully automate, and they've made a decision to keep every single person and then some, because they're planning on expanding their business, and they're doing it in a very inclusive way. So part of the issue is this fear. I mean, we're bringing the machines in. Are we going to be displaced? There's no communication. There's no sense of connection on the part of the employees to this change. And rarely are the employees, is the wisdom of the employees tapped in. Tom Culkin talked yesterday about humans adding wisdom to the machines. In these instances where we've seen it work, that's exactly what happened. And that's what we see with the coal miners adding their wisdom to coding, because there is this incredible accumulated wisdom that can be tapped.
In many cases also, I think that the mindset of being embracing of change and embracing of technology is critically important, because the automation will often come incrementally. And so if you're the holdout and the last person to do it, and you know, one thing got automated, and then another thing, and another thing. And by the way, I look at these not as things getting automated. I think of it as tools to help you do what you're trying to do. Exactly. So as you get more tools that help you, no one does the books on books anymore. They use spreadsheets and software. So as the tools come along, to try to have that open mindset, to try to embrace the tool, it'll be easier to move along with that lifelong learning than it will be if all of a sudden you wait until your skill set really is a mismatch for the organization.
Right. Yeah, I'd add one thing. I love that you raise a new question around culture, because this is impacting culture, and that touches on what's the role of management in the future. Right. And so we did some work around digital, the digital space, and found that yes, it's going to totally disrupt and automate some roles, but the role of manager will change too. In fact, about 20% will be different. And you say, what's the difference? Managing through uncertainty, leading a new type of workforce, curiosity, this learnability, even at the management level, will change. And so we've seen that already, we've identified it. So then the question becomes, how do you infuse that into a company, and that will impact the culture.
Yeah, because you can see that layer of management being a blocker from the worker feedback going up, because the managers don't know what to do, or they're afraid of losing their jobs. So why would they listen to what the workers have to say and be replaced?
It's a big challenge.
And first of all, I want to acknowledge your personal resilience, having been through an SAP implementation. So, because that's one of the skills you need. But
it was R3 software in SAP.
But I would add 2 layers to it, because you're really asking, how do I make this happen in an organization for my role in HR? And there's two levers you have. You have managers' individual goals, or the 2 levers, I should say, that I believe in work effectively. You have managers' individual goals, and you have your core values as an organization. So when Eric and I, way back, were working on State Farm and their automation system, they literally put in every division GM's goals, you will roll out one AI-based system in your division, because they knew that the change coming in AI was going to be big, and it went right into the comp plans. So it's a little heavy-handed, but it works because it's in the goals. Why do salespeople act that way? Read their comp plan. So comp is a big lever. The second place you do it that I think is ultimately more effective is at the area of core values. So I literally spent I run about a $15 million growing but small digital advertising company now, doing video. And I spent the whole day yesterday with the president of the company looking at the behaviors we're looking for under each core value. So 2 of the core values: embrace and drive change, run at challenges. So when you get down to the behaviors we're rating people on, the behaviors we're training people on, the skills we want people to have under those 2 values, there's a place there where you're in essence saying to the whole organization, we expect you to embrace and drive change, and we expect you to run at challenges. So I'd say those are 2 tools you have.
We have one more question behind you, and then we're going to have to call it quits because lunch will be ready. Yes. Tell us who you are.
I'm Leo Sprecher, and I'm in private sector, involved a little bit with education as well, and a Sloan alum. And throughout the conference, and you all have raised it again, you asked this question, who are we? How do we bring authority, begin to actually get standards set rather than just go to a lot of conferences and talk about it?
Right.
That problem.
It's fun, but,
And one thing I've observed, which is sort of a fascinating attempt at this, it's an organization called issue1.org. And Larry Lessig, who's a Massachusetts reformer in Harvard, started it, but there's quite an organization now involved with it. Their idea is to, of course, ultimately clean up Washington, but they're finding out it's just too hard to do. You just can't pull it off. So there's a lot of talk and no action. Mm-hmm. And the big effort now is to go to state and local levels and set up experiments, set up metrics, set up some value systems, and try to get some things to work at a much lower level. And I think that's where maybe all of us who want to make a difference ought to put more of our effort.
I should say one of my 10 jobs was 10 years at the National Governors Association, so I know a lot about state and local governments, and there is a tremendous amount going on. at that level, and always has been, which is why Justice Brandeis chose to talk about these entities as the laboratories of democracy, and it is a good place to work. The lights are going down. David's standing up. I know we're at a close. I want to thank my panelists, Todd Loofbourrow, Becky Frankiewicz. Give it up. Tom Hopcroft. Thank you.